Hello everyone, good evening. I am Shaya Hecht, psychotherapist working in the New York area, Queens and Brooklyn specifically. So glad for anyone who's joining tonight, where we're going to discuss a really important topic, avoidant attachment and how that plays out in therapy. Previously, we did a live on anxious attachment, and I think some of the feedback indicated that people wanted a live on avoidant attachment. So that's what brings us here tonight. Hopefully, I'll be able to give over some clarity on this type of relationship style, which basically refers to people who struggle within relationships with avoidance and try to avoid them, and specifically how that might apply to the therapeutic relationship, where this type of attachment style develops, what some of the challenges in therapy are for the therapist, for the client, and we'll take it from there. And I hope it'll be meaningful, helpful. So I guess we could begin. So like we discussed last time, there's the researcher that brought to our attention the idea of attachment is John Bowlby. I'm not going to get too technical, don't worry. But there was a famous study done by Mary Ainsworth where she basically identified different types of attachment styles. You can look up the study. It's called The Strange Situation. It's really interesting. And basically, you could just watch a YouTube video on it, so you don't have to read the research, don't worry. And basically, what she found were a few different types of attachment styles. So one of them is called avoidant attachment. Okay, and basically, that develops in children who have unresponsive or misattuned caregivers for the most part. And these parents, they might reject their child's innate need for secure and intimate bond, probably because of their own challenges with their own intimacy, and therefore those children develop what's called avoidance, where they stop reaching out eventually to get the support that they need because the parents really are not available for that. Okay, so what happens is though that people who have this type of attachment style end up really needing to be independent, where they really just find strength in being on their own, because being together with others is really distressing, even though it may not actually feel distressing anymore at that point, being close to people. But really, when they studied these children in this study, they found that even though they weren't showing interest in those parents, their levels of stress were extremely high. So the levels of stress are very, very high, even though it may seem like we don't need relationships anymore. And I know that there are certain people watching this probably who do actually believe that, and for a really good reason. They've found safety in believing that they don't need people. That way they don't have to face the rejection, the intense amount of pain that comes with rejection. But internally, research shows that they are highly stressed. And it usually hits a point when there's a highly stressful event, like a life event, like a divorce or even a birth. There are times where that attachment distress becomes very, very apparent, where they really just burst, just to say it that way, and they really need other people, and it comes out, and their needs come out. So what happens to an avoidant client who is coming into therapy? So, well, first of all, let's just talk about into adulthood what happens. So people who have avoidant attachment typically have higher rates of depression. They struggle with perfectionism. They have a hard time being vulnerable. They struggle being close to people. And they really struggle with trusting other people. And that makes a lot of sense. Again, this is their system's way of protecting them from really deeply painful rejection, which their body has experienced in the past, and they've found a way to really protect themselves. So we really want to honor and respect this type of presentation, because it's helping them survive the world, a very threatening world to them, and it's getting them through life. So we have to have a lot of honor and respect for such people. However, it does present a number of challenges within therapy, obviously, right? So first of all, within any relationship, it's going to present challenges because there's mistrust, there's challenges with intimacy. They don't want to be close, but even though they're could be very friendly and and seemingly close, but when it becomes to vulnerability and shedding the parts of themselves that maybe are uncomfortable to them, that's where it becomes highly distressing, even though it may not feel that way inside. And they say, I don't need that, and they run from such an experience. So hopefully that's clear so far. And of course, if you have any questions throughout, feel free to type it into the chat and I'll try to get to it. Okay, so there is a strategy that avoidant attachment clients or humans implement, which is called deactivation, where we basically try whatever we can to avoid any type of topics or emotions around attachment. Okay, so we're not going to want to talk about stress within relationships. We're not going to want to face those stressors. So what we might do is really minimize, right? One way to do that is to minimize that relationships really aren't important, or to minimize how I feel about these relationships and stuff like that. Okay, so basically any time this type of client might walk into a therapy office, they may actually believe that nothing really has happened to them that's causing this, right? Because they've minimized internally for a really good reason. Like we said, it's not their fault, it's not a judgment. They need to survive the world and the way that, and the scary relationship, the threatening relationship, and the pain of rejection. So what they do is they convince themselves that really nothing's happened to them. So they might idealize their parent and say, my parents were amazing and perfect and incredible. Or they may just avoid thinking about that altogether and shut all those emotions down, and therefore believe that they're okay and they don't need people, and they just know that they're in therapy. Maybe somebody convinced them to go. Maybe they're not feeling great because they're feeling somewhat depressed or something like that, and they're not really going to be open to connecting it to some attachment wound, because like we said, we want to avoid any type of emotion like that because it's highly distressing to them, because they've experienced a significant amount of pain around that. Okay, so what do we have to do in terms of treatment? This is very complicated, right? Because the client on the one hand is there because they need to be close to some degree, right? But on the other hand, they're going to avoid and minimize and just protect themselves from such reality. So it's going to be very, very challenging. However, like we said, the client's going to have high levels of anxiety around attachment when discussing attachment. So therefore, if the therapist even brings it up, they're going to resist it and resist it. And what that could cause is something called countertransference, which we spoke about last time, where the therapist can be affected by such a thing and react also. So we're going to talk more about that soon. Okay. So what do we do? So we know that people who have been through attachment trauma, the only way that they can heal with the host of psychological issues that might come through that is through a relationship. The wound happened within a relationship, so the healing has to happen within a relationship. However, the client feels safer avoiding the relationship. So that's the big stress that we're talking about. So when a therapist even maybe validates a client, which is a classic therapist-y type of thing to do, it could be highly distressing to a client, right? And this plays out all the time in therapy, where we might validate a struggle that the client had within a relationship, validate the emotions that are coming up for them, and they're really resistant to hearing that. They might avoid it. They might minimize it. They might just say, that's what you're saying because you're my therapist and you need to say that, or something like that. So even though it's really genuine, hopefully, and compassionate, and something that really the client deserves to hear, there's going to be a high resistance to it. And again, it's not their fault. They're trying to protect themselves from the potential that this relationship will bring, the potential pain that this relationship could bring, from the pain of rejection and shame and all of those things. So they need to reject even the therapist, which makes a ton of sense, right? We also have to remember that in general, like we spoke about, I think at some point, in general, there's a high resistance to trauma and trauma dialogue from society and from ourselves. So it's very hard for us to even embrace that there's such a thing. So we're going to avoid that also. The issue is, though, that if the therapist lets the client do that, which therapists might want to do to a certain degree, because you see that the client's resisting it, it's uncomfortable for the therapist potentially, and they may want to help the client not have to feel that sort of distress. So they may try to keep it light, and stuff like that, and not go back there and not talk about attachments and relationships, or do attachment type things like giving a compliment or providing validation. if the therapist allows for that type of distraction, then what happens is that the therapist sort of is also minimizing in a certain way what the client has been through and the fact that this is very hard for them, and it's sort of enabling the avoidance, which is part of why they're having the issues that they're having. So really the therapist has to figure out a way to be attuned to the client, really attuned with empathy and care, but to not overly overwhelm this client, which could be very, very tricky, right? So that it takes a lot of skill, and the therapist will no doubt make a lot of mistakes here. Okay, so I hope that I will admit it to everyone watching this. I hope it's hundreds and thousands of people. Please spread it. I make mistakes all the time, and it's very, very delicate. Okay, because we have to sort of pace the client and know where the client's at, and the client's highly anxious, and it's very hard. So we're going to know from the reaction of the client how we're doing, and the commitment that the therapist has, hopefully, is that we are going to work this through. And if you're feeling pain from me, I'm going to allow for a space where you could express all of that pain. And the only way the client's going to be willing to do that is if there's safety within the relationship. So the therapist must be creating a foundation of safety within this relationship, which again is very tricky because there's a high resistance. But hopefully there's a foundation of safety where the client can express their frustration within this relationship. Oftentimes clients really won't feel safe doing that, or will try to avoid, because that's their attachment style. So instead of expressing their anger and frustration directly to the therapist, they might just not come to therapy the next week, right? Or they might say that they don't need therapy anymore and really they're okay. They might try to avoid the relationship and say, listen, life is very hectic right now, I can't really do therapy. And they really mean well, by the way. They're not lying to themselves. They may not even be in tune to the challenge that's going on between them and the therapist, because being in tune with that is highly distressing as well. So they're so used to avoiding what's happening for them that they may not even be aware of what's going on. Sometimes they might be aware and they might feel really scared and worried or overwhelmed, so they're trying to avoid. So if you have any questions on what I've said so far, please let me know. I'm just going to check if there are any questions. Okay. Right, so again, we have the attachment style, which is a high resistance to closeness for good reason and valid reason. We have to have a lot of respect for our brains and bodies who help us survive the world, right? So that's what's going on there. And of course, naturally, well, that leads to a host of psychological issues, which we discussed. And the person might try to convince themselves that they are okay on their own, but really they're highly stressed when they're on their own. Okay. So now the therapist's job, again, is to tune them back into the stress that they feel within relationships. But naturally, the client's going to be, so it's like a paradox, because naturally the client's going to be very avoidant to that and is going to react to that, maybe with anger, maybe with frustration, maybe with shutting down, maybe with different things. And the therapist has to be very in tune with their own feelings, to know how they're feeling about that, so that they could maintain the safety and not react also overly aggressively and stuff like that, right? So their job is to hold the safety and continue to gently try to challenge the client to tune in to attachment type stress, whether it's stories from the past, whether it's what's going on between them and the therapist, whether it's going on with their relationships in general. Okay, so I'm seeing some questions. So let's see what this is. How to help an avoidant client who is very quiet feel safe. Yeah. So there are probably many ways to do that. My style is to allow for to me, the safety is to meet the client where their nervous system is at. That's my rule of thumb, really. And if I have an agenda that a client needs to talk, that's my countertransference, I think. And therefore, I'm going to probe the client and try to get them to talk. I think that's going to overwhelm them, right? If we see that a client's very quiet, I think they're going to feel safest when we let them be quiet, if that's what they need. That doesn't mean we leave them alone in their silence. We can be with someone in their silence. We can tune into their silence, and we can let them know that we care that they're silent right now, and that if that's what they need, we're going to let them do that, but we're going to be with them. And if they feel like they can't speak, great, but they don't need to. To me, that is the best way to help them feel safe. Yes, silence is very tough to work with. And again, if the therapist has a need to feel like they're doing great work and stuff like that, or whatever their triggers are, they're going to have a much harder time working with therapists who are silent. And of course, I'm guilty of that as well, right? I also want to feel like I'm doing great work, and it was not always easy for me to sit with a client in silence. It's still not the easiest thing in the world, but I try my best because that's what my client needs. So I've really become quite okay sitting with people in silence. I've had to do my own work to get into that place, but we owe it to our clients as therapists to be as safe as we can so that they could feel as safe as possible. Someone's asking, is this why I can't accept compliments? I don't know you. I'm not sure, but it's very possible that you have a resistance to being seen, because that is highly distressing because of what we talked about, where that means we're getting closer to someone, which means that they have the potential to really hurt me, which is highly stressful, especially if we've been through attachment trauma in the past where we've been rejected and we've been shamed and things like that. So your system will not accept a compliment, will minimize a compliment, will try to avoid compliments, will actually I have clients who get pretty angry at me when I offer compliments, and I validate that they're angry and it makes sense to me. And but my job is not to stop complimenting them. My job is to try to still have them tune into that emotional distress in a safe way so that it's not too overwhelming, and to help them through that experience. Okay. So it's, again, a really important, a challenge, defensive avoidance. And as clients, if your clients watching this, it's really important to know that your growth is going to be tuning in to your own distress and stress within relationships. And it's extremely hard, but it's really not your responsibility. I can't stress this enough. You don't have to work that hard you're going to have to work hard to do that, but it's the therapist's responsibility to work hard to create the safety that will allow you to do that. I'll say it again. It's the therapist's responsibility to create the safety, to work really hard to create that safety, and to be really worked out themselves so that they can be a safe person for you to tune into what's coming up for you and feel safe enough, hopefully, over time. It's not easy. Over time, we'll gently tiptoe in, just saying you go into a pool and you want to test the temperature, you tiptoe in a little bit, you come right out because it's hard to tolerate. But as you go in a little more and a little more and a little more, you'll be able to start tolerating this sort of stress within relationships. We have to expect that the therapist is going to make mistakes, and I think we have to sort of honor that too. The therapist is human. They're trying really hard. Hopefully, right? But they need to own up to their mistakes when they make mistakes, and they need to help through the process. So, the instinct might be to run. Really, the best thing is to be able to express yourself, but that's going to be super hard because that's, again, a form of intimacy, right? So that's going to be really, really hard for you. But hopefully the therapist creates enough safety where they allow you to do that, right? And not run away. Their job is to tune you back in. Otherwise, they're really not helping you grow. You're going to grow by being able to tolerate the distress within relationships. Okay. So I think I covered the topic to the best of my ability. Somebody submitted questions in advance where they asked, what are the signs of avoidant attachment in therapy? It's a very good question. So hopefully I covered that. I'll just summarize, right? The anxiety that you have maybe coming into therapy. Maybe some people who are avoidant are thinking, I don't really need people, so why am I in therapy? I'm fine without relationships, so I'll just solve it myself. I'll figure it out myself. I've figured out my whole life myself. I should be figuring this out myself. And actually, there's sometimes a lot of shame underneath that, where like clients think that they should have solved this already, and that might be coming from the fact that asking for support is highly shameful. And it's also highly triggering and anxiety provoking, right? So they may be really ashamed that they're even coming into therapy to begin with, right? So if you're somebody who thinks about like, I don't really need others, I don't really need therapists, I should figure this out on my own, this is possible, a symptom of avoidant attachment. But you should look at, in general, your relationships. If it's very hard for you to be vulnerable and to show your imperfections and to get deeply connected to somebody, then and you find yourself avoiding these type of relationships, then that's a sign that you have avoidant attachment. And if you're trying to avoid your therapist, you want to cancel, you're feeling like not coming, that's very normal and typical. That might happen, and that's a sign that you're trying to avoid because you're feeling unsafe, and that's totally acceptable. Right? The therapist's job is to help you through that process. Somebody asked, when my therapist asks me questions to get to know me more, it feels so intruding. So let's just validate that. That makes a lot of sense, right? Because they're trying to get closer to you, and naturally you're going to have resistance to that. So I put up a wall, which is true, and I tell her I'm not answering. Is that considered avoidant? Yeah, that's considered a form of avoidance, but you have a right to not answer the question, okay? Any therapist who pressures you to answer a question is not being fair to you, in my opinion. That's my opinion. Take it or leave it. You have a right. Just because the therapist asked the question, that doesn't mean they earned the right to your answer, okay? And that's true with all of your relationships. Only when you feel safe enough do you answer questions. And if a therapist can't handle that, sorry, but that's the therapist's problem, not yours, right? So it's really important to know that to pace yourself, and the therapist really should be pacing this for you, and to express, hey, I'm not feeling okay answering that. And hopefully your therapist knows that that's coming from your resistance, which makes a lot of sense, and your defense, and it's helping you feel safe. So they're going to allow for that to happen and actually help you through that and validate that this is super hard, and that will help create more safety, which will help you tune in more, which will help you express yourself more, which will help you embrace relationships more. So I think I covered it. I'll stay on another few seconds here if someone has a question. But hopefully this was clear, meaningful. I hope that I was sensitive to people who deal with this, because this is something that deserves a lot of sensitivity. There's a lot of wounding here, and wounds are raw and they need careful attention. So I hope I did that. And if anyone has any further questions, they could obviously check in with me. And if we need another live, let me know. But other than that, have a great night, everyone. You're welcome. Take care.